I'll start. My name is Rod, and I like to party.
So you mean whiskey?
What?
You're saying it weird.
Saying what weird?
All of it.
Where do you get off?
All right, welcome to the Church Planter Podcast. I'm Robert Frazier, your host for the Wednesday show. Tim Galley's not here with us today, but I have a special guest with us. His name is Steve Pike. Many of you may know him from the Church Multiplication Network that he helped found in 2008. It's a part of the Assemblies of God mission community. They have seen over 5,000 churches planted across the U.S., trained almost 8,000 church planters, and so we figured he had a ton to share with us about what does it look like to do the beginning of the journey well, and that's what we're going to be focusing on over the next few months. Is for those of you who are in the process of planting, what are the things that you've got to do at the beginning that are going to set yourself up for long-term impact? And Steve is now leading Next Wave, an Urban Islands project, and is really shifted his focus towards what does it look like to do church planting well in an urban context, which is a particularly difficult and different set of questions. So welcome to the show, Steve.
Thanks. Honored to be here.
Yeah, glad you could jump in today. Well, I first want to start with you as a planter. Tell me your journey as a church planter and how God got a hold of your heart.
Yeah, boy, great question. So I was serving on the staff of a megachurch in just outside of Chicago in 1989. Some of you peeps were not even born then, but anyway, there I was, cruising along. Everything's going great, happy, and I started to have this sense of God's getting ready to move us on to something else. My wife and I, without going into the details, we had a very definite sense of calling to missions. Is what we thought, and so we thought that meant like Africa or something, or someplace besides the United States. So we started pursuing that, and in the process of doing so, had another point where we realized, wait, God's calling us to do mission here in the United States by starting a new church somewhere where there's not a lot of people that are already following Jesus. And so at the same time we were kind of thinking that, this guy who was a missionary in Utah, he was planting churches in Utah. He came to our church and spoke, and I'm like, that's it. That's the place. My wife and I both realized. So we ended up, feeling like we're supposed to go to Utah and plant a church, and we'd never done that before. And honestly, in 1989, oh my goodness, there were very little written resources.
Yeah.
It's weird because churches were being started back then, but they were more really started. It was like people would say, "Hey, we need another Baptist church in this town, or we need another Lutheran church,
It
or
was
something."
driven by the denomination wanting like another version of what they were doing.
Right. We need a place for our people to meet, was kind of why churches were. I mean, that's oversimplifying, and it wasn't all that, but that was kind of the main reason I think there wasn't a lot of intentionality in church planting, because we weren't thinking about it being a way to reach lost people. It was more of a way to serve found people. And so
it wasn't a mission, it was an organization. It was not missionaries going out. It was, hey, let's gather up the Christians in this neighborhood and care for them.
Exactly. That's how it was being done. So I hadn't really I actually had thought about starting churches before, because I'm kind of a starter. I'm a habitual starter, but other efforts I had tried got the kibosh because people didn't think it was a good idea, whatever. Anyway, at this point, nobody cared about going to, I mean, if you're going to Utah, God bless you. Hope it works out. We'll throw a little money at you.
Yeah.
So I went through the process of talking to my pastor and saying, hey, I think I'm supposed to go start a church in Utah. And he said, okay, well, we'll, let's figure out a transition strategy. And so I decided because one of the things obviously you got to figure out is like, how are we going to feed ourselves?
Mm-hmm.
And the Assemblies of God, which is the denomination that I'm affiliated with, has this program they call Home Missions, or now it's called U.S. Missions, and basically allows you to put on the tag of a missionary and invite people to support you, and they have a way to manage that money and do it so you don't end up doing jail ministry from inside the jail.
So you weren't going to You weren't going to go to Utah and open up a coffee shop?
Well,
Not most
that's a very very insightful comment. That would be pretty much suicidal. It's a coffee starting a church as a coffee shop in Utah, especially back then.
Yeah.
Maybe I could start a church by starting a place where Mormons could buy their Mormon underwear or something like that.
An ice cream shop or something.
Yeah. But not a coffee shop, right?
No.
Yeah, and so, but you actually that we're joking about it, but the weird thing about Utah is it is, and again, I think it's changed somewhat, but it's still to some degree is a very unique cultural place in the United States. About 70%, this was in 1989, 1990 when I went there, about 70% of the population would identify as Mormon, whether they were active or not. But they were very committed to the idea that the Mormon Church is right. The
Their
Church of
religious
Jesus Christ
identity
Latter-day
was
Saints.
fundamentally Mormon, even if they weren't engaged with it. That was how they saw themselves. Yeah,
Exactly. It's kind of like maybe the same time frame. A lot of people in America thought, well, I'm a Christian. They thought they're Mormon. But I would say it was a little bit stronger than that because, what I found was the really committed Mormons were actually really welcoming and kind and stuff to us. The people who were more, they call them, now I forgot the word, but they're Jack Mormons. Thank you.
yeah.
Right. I don't know why I blanked on that, but the Jack Mormons are the ones who would fight you. Like if you said, "Hey, we're starting a church and it's not Mormon," they're like, "Hey, don't be messing with Mormon." And so that was a surprise. The other 30% was broken down pretty strongly between 29% of the rest of the population hated any form of religion and had no desire to do anything, have anything to do with it, and then a tiny little sliver of maybe 1.5% of the population would identify as what we would call biblical Christians, or people who, understood Scripture to be the guide for following Jesus. And so, if you're going to start a church there, it's pretty difficult to do it by just saying, "Hey, we're starting a new church." Nobody's really that excited about it, which forced us, we couldn't quote unquote cheat with, like, we'll just get a bunch of people to move from one church to another. We actually had to go out and win people to Jesus. So, we figured out how to get enough income to keep our family afloat and just move there. And just started trying to connect with people and win people to Jesus, and that's how we started the church.
Well, let's dive in right there. What was the stuff that you thought would work and didn't, and what was the stuff that surprised you along the way as you saw the Spirit start to move ahead of you and work and all that?
Yeah. So before we moved to Utah, one of my neighbors I lived in Naperville, which is outside of Chicago, and one of my neighbors there was a very strong, committed Mormon guy and his wife, and they had like 6 or 7 kids, and he was a research scientist for AT&T. I mean, this guy was super smart, and we became really good friends. And man, I expected the entire state of Utah to be filled with people like him. I thought, like, this guy's the normal Mormon, and he was like super committed. I mean, he had a really genuine faith. I mean, we had some fascinating faith conversations. So anyway, probably the biggest surprise was most of the people in Utah didn't know a whole lot. They had a very truncated understanding of the Christian churches that had been kind of delivered to them through some of the ways they've been taught. And so I kind of expected people like my neighbor, and most of them were people who were just like, "Nah, we're not interested."
Yeah.
He was actually into spiritual conversations. So it was that was surprising to me. I think another thing, though, on the other hand, in contrast, that was surprising to me was how easy it was to talk to people about spiritual things there, because they were curious. And so a lot of what I did was just go around and knock on doors and stuff like that. But I think the big learning was, because here's the big question I had going there was like, I don't even know how to lead a Mormon to Jesus. Like, how do I even do that? And so
what does this conversation about atonement and gospel look like when all of the words that you're using have different meanings to them? Yeah,
exactly. that was the challenge. Was there's like this several layers of communication that were you had to figure out a way to get through, and it was just in retrospect I think I was overthinking it because they're, Mormons are people, they're just people, and if you try, you can overthink stuff. So anyway, what happened was, we were on our knees, man, praying like, God, help us, and help us to help people come to Jesus. And so when we were just in the process of moving there, and one of the things we decided to do was, we're going to buy a house here, like to let people know we're not just here temporarily. We're not going to rent, we're going to buy.
Yeah.
And so, we went through the process. We found a house. We went into, and this is back in the days before you just did all your loan stuff online. We had to go sit with a loan officer and make an application, and then they processed the loan, and then you came back and you signed the paper. So it was like a 2-week process. So during the interview, we're going through our loan officer's name was Lori, and she said, "What's your occupation?" And I said, "Pastor." And she said, "What's that?" And I had never been asked that question.
It's
before.
like a
What's
bishop,
that?
but you work for it's a, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, that I did have to translate. Say, well, it's a bishop who gets paid. She goes, "Really? They pay you to do this?" I mean, she's a loan officer, so she's like, "It can't be that much." That was not a good answer. And so, so she's like, "Okay," and so she said, "Well, come back in 2 weeks. I'll let you know." So we go back, and now, we've been informed, yes, your loan's been approved, and now you just need to come and sign the papers. So it's kind of a celebratory moment, and our Mormon real estate guy was with us to just be there to see the paper signed, because of course he gets paid then, and
He's there.
and so he's there.
He's there for.
Yeah. So he's in the room, and we're going through signing the papers, and he goes, "Well, I got to move on. I have another appointment." He walked out the door, and as the door shut behind him, Lori said, "Oh, I'm glad he's gone." And I said, "Why?" And she said, "Well, because I have some questions I want to ask you." I said, "Okay, what's that?" She said, "Well," she said, "you told me you were a pastor, so I was just really curious about that, because when you describe what a pastor does," because I basically said, what pastors do is they help people follow Jesus. And she said, I just had never heard talk like that. So she said, "I decided to check you out." She said, "I've checked you out deeper and more thoroughly than any other person I've ever done." And I'm freaking out because I'm thinking about speeding tickets and stuff like that I've gotten over the years, and dumb adolescence things I did 40 years ago. No, well, maybe at that point it wasn't 40 years; it was 15 years
much
before.
sooner. Yeah.
Yeah. And so, but she said, and I said, "Well, what'd you find out?" And she goes, "Well," she said, you appear to be exactly who you say you are." And she said, "I just have one more question for you." And I said, "What's that?" She said, "When you start your church, can I come to it?" And I said, "Why would you think you couldn't?" She said, "Well, I'm Mormon." And she said, "I'm a divorced mom, so I'm kind of rejected by the Mormon church." And she said, "Does your church accept divorced moms? I've got my little boy and me." I said, "We would love you to come, Lori." So Lori came the very first time we had a public gathering. She was there. And I don't know, 2 or 3 weeks into it, she responded to an invitation to accept Jesus into her life. And I started to see, okay, that's how it can happen. And it happens through relationship, and it happens through connection, and it happens through being connected to people in ways that aren't spiritual, like getting a loan, or being on a ball team, or just, working together, or going to school together, and all those kinds of things. And so that's, over the years, we saw hundreds of those stories happen, not just through us personally, but as the church began to grow, and Lori brought her friends, and over the years, it grew into a significant faith community. We were able to help start 5 other churches out of that church in Utah, because we kind of figured out how to do it. And so that's my startup story.
I love it, because every single church planter has a unique set of circumstances. And I think I'm drawn to your story. My high school is probably 65-70% Mormon. And so
so you get it. Yeah.
I live that, here in Boise, we used to have a much more significant Mormon population. It's much smaller now than when I was a child, but it's a different sort of mission field that has a different set of parameters. And what I'm seeing is, we have 60% of the Treasure Valley are religious, none of the aboves. almost all of them,
Yeah.
probably 2/3 of them are ex-Mormons because they have
Right.
said, I've tried religion and I found that it didn't give them what they were looking for. But all of them,
Right.
I think if you dug in, they're still looking for grace. They're still
Right.
looking
Oh yeah.
for what the gospel has to offer. They just think that religion has no way to do that. And the answer is religion doesn't have a way to do that. It's the kingdom
Right.
of God coming in power through the presence of the
Right.
Spirit and people. And, it's that work. I want to hear from you. We're going to talk later about networks and church planting, kind of across the U.S. I want to hear more about what you're doing with Next Wave and Urban Islands. But I want to start with,
Mhm.
well, you sit with a lot of church planters. You've
Mhm.
probably sat with hundreds along the journey, and I've sat
Mhm.
with a lot too. But I want to hear from you when you're walking with new church planters and they sit down with you for that lunch meeting, and they're like, "Hey, give me the tips and tricks." What do you? And we don't actually tell them the tips and tricks when they ask for them. We talk about like spiritual formation because that's most of the time the answer that they need. But I want to hear
Yeah.
from you. What's the advice that you give to church planters who are preparing? Or let's say they're a year or two out from planting. They're kind of at the very beginning of
Yeah.
the journey. They stumble upon Church Planter podcast, or they start reading a book, or they went
Right.
to a conference. Their church went to Exponential, and they had that end of
Right.
Exponential moment when they went forward and received prayer. What do you want to hand to them as they're starting out? How would you want to shape their journey as they're thinking about what's next?
Yeah. Well, I think I don't know if I share this, but I have kind of a framework that I think is universally applicable, no matter what model, no matter what way people are approaching church planning. It seems like people kind of go through these 5 phases in this sequence. It's pretty much sequential. I mean, some of it can happen at the same time, but just the 5 phases would be. I'll just name them and then I'll describe them. Discovery, discerning or discernment or whatever. Discover, discern, deploy, develop, and duplicate. Those are the 5 phases. And what you're talking about is the discover phase. The discovery phase when people come, usually when they don't, where you described them, they don't yet know, like, I'm supposed to go to Boise and start a church. They just are thinking about the idea of church planning, and that's the discovery mode. And in the discovery mode, if somebody's in that mode, because I always kind of try to find out where they're at on the journey. Because sometimes I'm talking to somebody and they've already decided where they're going. They've already moved there. They just want me to say, okay, do this. And so that's different. And I actually prefer talking to somebody in discovery mode because I think we can help them. But anyway, what I encourage people in discovery is number one, just get curious. Just learn everything you can. Look out there. Go hang out with Robert Fraser. Go hang out with other people that you know about that are starting churches, and just get familiar with what's going on. And don't lock yourself into, don't pick the first thing you see and go, ooh, I want to do that, because that's going to be too narrow. So just give yourself time to do some just exploration and be curious, and and listen to God, and even do some pre-assessment kind of stuff. Kind of look at yourself and think about, am I really a person who enjoys being the point person of a startup endeavor? Do I have that in my background? Just look at that kind of stuff. So that would be that discover phase where it's like, uh, I'm wondering if God might be calling me to church planting. And when you move from discover to discern is when you've had something happen, or you're starting to really think, wait, I think God's calling me to start a church. Then you move into the discern phase.
Well, let's
And
let's
then the discern,
let's
okay,
double click on Discover real quick before we move on.
okay,
Um,
sure.
so it seems like there's guys who they kind of go into the black box of themselves during the discover phase. A lot of those guys are like, I think there's something stirring inside of me. I need to piece it
Yeah,
through. And then what they do is they come out with a proclamation. This is what God has told me to do.
right.
Or guys have this inkling, and then they're waiting for somebody else to give them permission to go. And they're like sitting around hoping that somebody's going to tell them, hey, I'm going to give you
Right.
$250,000. But it really, everybody needs to be somewhere in the middle there where there's space
Yeah.
for people to speak into it. How do
Right.
you tell, young church planters, hey, take a beat, slow down,
Oh
deal
yeah.
with mentors?
Oh yeah.
Like what's the process that you ask them to
Well,
go into?
well, see, yeah, see, I mean, that's all part, yeah. So yeah, in that discover phase, if I'm talking to that person, I am saying, um, slow down for sure. I mean, we've turned it into some kind of franchise thing where even the language, like you're 2 years out from church planting, that is faulty language. And what I try to do is reorient their thinking process again around these phases. These phases don't have time frames attached to them. I say stay in the discover phase until you know that God is calling you to this. And I don't know how to tell you when you're going to know that,
Yeah.
because I think it's very different for every person. But don't move forward until you've got that. And so you pointed out, one mistake you can make is just sort of navel gaze, and do all kinds of spiritual and mental gymnastics to try to psych yourself into something. And that's why I think a better approach is just start being curious, just start learning what you can. Yeah, go to exponential, but don't go there, don't give in to the impulse to just fall in love with somebody's story and then start fantasizing that that's going to happen for you. That's what ends up really hurting a lot of people, is they get attracted to a story and they kind of resonate with, they feel like, oh, I'm the same kind of person and it's going to happen for me. And every church plant is a work of art.
Mhm.
And to just narrow it down into just copying exactly what somebody else did. Obviously, we can learn from each other. We can be guided from each other, which is why you want to be curious and learn. Um, so I just really encourage people to take their time, and sometimes I help them think about, like, especially if you're going to a place. Let's just be real about this. Like, you went to Boise. What I know about Boise is, yeah, it has a high population of Mormon people. So it's not the place that there's other, well, let's just say the southern United States, you've got people, it's still kind of a Christian culture down there. And starting a church down there, the way you do that is completely different than a place
Yeah.
where people, you've got to really start at a different place with moving people toward Jesus and all the stuff you do.
Well, we
So
have problems with that around here, where guys come in expecting a launch large model that works well in the South, and they show up and they're like, we're gonna have 300 people opening Sunday. It's like, God bless you if you do, but that's gonna be a tough pull, man. That's not what happened.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah, absolutely. So, so that's, so I really try to actually manage their expectations. I say things like, this might take you, 5 years from this point before you actually start to see anything happening. So it's not going to be 6 months. If it does happen in 6 to 12 months, that's great. I'm not against that, but let's just slow down and get everything in the right order, because really, again, the discovery phase is when they're just sort of sampling what's out there and increasing their knowledge, and just enjoy it, because the next phase, and I know you said let's double click
oh, yeah, we're ready to move on.
on discover, but I want it, because I think this is where it really helps people when they realize what you need to do next is not just go dive bomb into the first community that you think. This is where discernment is. Okay, one of the things you want to discern is to where, or to whom, or to where and whom are you called? Like, who is God breaking your heart for? Um, and again, this is so it's. I think that the transition between discover to deploy, I'm sorry, discover to discern, is that you've arrived at a place where you are very sure, you feel this sense of calling, and now I want you to dig deeper and go, okay, what is that calling? Where's that calling focused? Is it a place? Is it a people? Is it both a place and a people? Because at the end of the day, starting a church is local. I mean, even if it's an online church, it's still local to there's there's a set of people. It's gamers, it's this, it's that, it's people who, work in the airline industry, whatever, they have a hard time connecting with a brick and mortar church in a geographic location. So, but it's still, it's local in the sense that the people are going to be, generally, it's really tough to have a church where you have 20 different languages spoken. I know people are trying to pull that off, but most of the time, same language. Most of the time, a similar kind of culture. And so, anyway, the point is, who's God breaking your heart for?